Margaret Chun had lived in the same small house on Maple Street for 35 years. The white picket fence needed paint, and the front steps creaked when you walked on them, but it was home. More than that, it was the house where her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was just 7 years old. Grandma Rose had been the kind of woman who never met a stranger. Their house had always been full of people, travelers who needed a place to stay, neighbors who needed help, and anyone who looked like they could use a good meal. Rose had run a small boarding house in town back in the day, and even after she retired, she kept that same spirit of helping others. Now, at 42, Margaret tried to live the same way. She worked at the local diner during the day, serving coffee and pie to the same faces she'd known all her life. The town of Millbrook wasn't what it used to be. Once, it had been a thriving place with 3 factories and a main street full of shops. Now, most of the young people left after high school, looking for opportunities in bigger cities. The factories had closed one by one, and half the shops on Main Street had "for rent" signs in their windows, but Margaret stayed. This was her home, her community, and she believed in taking care of people who needed help. On that Tuesday evening in October, the weather forecast had warned about a big storm coming. Margaret had stocked up on candles and batteries, filled some jugs with water, and made sure her flashlight worked. She'd lived through plenty of storms before. What she hadn't expected was for this one to be so fierce. The rain started around 6 in the evening, just light drops at first. By 8 o'clock, it was coming down so hard she could barely see across the street. The wind was howling like nothing she'd ever heard, making the old house shake and rattle. Tree branches were flying around outside, and she could hear things crashing in the distance. Then around 9:30, the power went out. Margaret lit some candles and settled into her favorite chair with a book, figuring she'd just wait it out. She'd been through power outages before, but this storm kept getting worse. The thunder was so loud it made her jump, and the lightning was lighting up her whole living room every few seconds. That's when she heard the knocking dot. At first, she thought it might be a tree branch hitting the door, but then she heard it again. Definitely someone knocking, and knocking hard. Margaret grabbed her flashlight and went to the front window. Through the rain and darkness, she could make out 2 figures on her front porch. Her first thought was to be careful. You hear stories on the news about people who pretend to need help and then rob you. But as she got closer to the door, she could see them more clearly through the glass panels beside her front door. It was a man and what looked like a young boy, both completely soaked from the rain. The man was tall, maybe in his 40s, with dark hair that was plastered to his head from the rain. He was wearing a nice jacket that was now completely wet, and he kept his hand protectively on the shoulder of the boy next to him. The boy looked to be about 10 years old, with light brown hair and the kind of sneakers that cost more than Margaret spent on shoes in a whole year. They both looked miserable, cold, and completely harmless. Margaret opened the door, and immediately the wind tried to blow it out of her hands. "Oh my goodness," she called out over the storm. "What are you doing? Out in this weather?" The man stepped forward, keeping the boy close to him. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he said, having to raise his voice over the wind and rain. "Our car broke down about 2 miles back, and we've been walking. I saw your light and hoped, well, I hoped maybe you could help us." Margaret didn't even hesitate. "Of course. Come in right now." She stepped back and gestured for them to come inside. They hurried through the door, dripping water all over her hardwood floor, but Margaret didn't care about that. The important thing was getting them warm and dry. "I'm David," the man said, extending his hand. "And this is my son, Tommy." "I'm Margaret," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, and even though he was soaking wet and probably exhausted, he had kind eyes. "You must be freezing. Let me get you some towels." As she hurried to the linen closet, Margaret could hear David talking quietly to Tommy, reassuring him that they were safe now. When she came back with an armful of towels, she noticed that David was looking around her living room, taking in the family photos on the mantel, the well-worn furniture and the candles she'd lit during the power outage. "This is very kind of you," David said as he started drying his hair with one of the towels. We didn't know what we were going to do. The storm came up so fast. Tommy hadn't said a word yet, but he was shivering despite the towel wrapped around his shoulders. Margaret's heart went out to him. You poor thing, she said gently. You must be scared and cold. How about I make you some hot chocolate? Tommy's eyes lit up a little at that, and he nodded. I have a gas stove, Margaret explained to David, so even without power I can still cook. Are you hungry? I made a big pot of stew earlier today. We don't want to impose, David started to say, but Margaret cut him off. Nonsense. My grandmother always said there's no such thing as imposing when someone needs help. Besides, I made way too much stew for just me. As Margaret bustled around her kitchen, heating up the stew and making hot chocolate by candlelight, she learned a little bit about her unexpected guests. David explained that they were traveling, just the two of them, and had been planning to stop in the next town for the night when their rental car started making strange noises and then just died. We were actually having a really nice trip until this happened, David said, accepting a bowl of stew gratefully. It's been just Tommy and me for a while now. His mother and I got divorced recently, and I thought a road trip might be good for both of us. Margaret nodded sympathetically. She'd never been married herself, but she'd seen enough families go through divorce to know how hard it could be, especially on the kids. Tommy finally started talking a little as he warmed up with the hot chocolate and stew. He told Margaret about some of the places they'd visited on their trip, museums and parks and historical sites. The boy was clearly smart, asking thoughtful questions about her house and the town. How long have you lived here? Tommy asked. All my life, Margaret replied. This was my grandmother's house, and before that it belonged to her parents. Our family has been in Millbrook for almost 100 years. It must be nice, David said, having that kind of connection to a place, that sense of belonging somewhere. There was something wistful in his voice that made Margaret look at him more closely. In the candlelight, she could see that despite being younger than her, he had the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been through some difficult times recently. Outside, the storm was still raging, maybe even getting worse. Through her kitchen window, Margaret could see tree branches whipping around in the wind, and every few minutes there was another crash of thunder that made them all jump a little. I don't think this storm is going to let up any time soon, Margaret observed, and even if it does, you're not going to be able to get your car fixed or find a hotel tonight. Why don't you stay here? I have a spare room upstairs. David looked uncertain. That's incredibly generous, but we've already put you out. Enough. You haven't put me out at all, Margaret said firmly. In fact, it's nice to have some company during this storm. This old house can feel pretty lonely when the weather gets bad, and it was true. Margaret had been living alone since her grandmother passed away 8 years ago, and while she was used to it, there was something comforting about having other people in the house during such a fierce storm. After some more gentle insisting from Margaret, David finally agreed. She showed them upstairs to the spare room, the same room where travelers had stayed when her grandmother ran her boarding house years ago. It had twin beds, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the backyard. The bathroom is right across the hall, Margaret explained. I put some extra blankets on the beds in case you get cold during the night. And don't worry about the storm. This house has been standing for 80 years, and it's weathered plenty of storms before this one. As she said goodnight and headed back downstairs, Margaret felt a warm satisfaction in her chest. Her grandmother would have been proud. Rose had always believed that helping strangers was one of the most important things a person could do, because you never knew when you might be the stranger in need of help. Margaret had no idea, as she blew out the candles and settled into her own bed listening to the storm rage outside, that the two people sleeping in her spare room would change her life completely. She had no way of knowing that David was much more than just a divorced father on a road trip with his son. All she knew was that she'd done what felt right. She'd helped two people who needed help. And sometimes that's all it takes to set extraordinary events in motion. Margaret woke up the next morning to the sound of voices coming from her kitchen. For a moment she was confused. She lived alone, so who could be talking downstairs? Then she remembered the storm and David and Tommy sleeping in her spare room. When she made her way downstairs, still in her robe and slippers, she found David at her kitchen sink. He had his sleeves rolled up and was working on something under the faucet with a screwdriver he must have found in her junk drawer. "Good morning," he said, looking up with a smile. "I hope you don't mind. I noticed your faucet was dripping pretty badly last night, so I thought I'd take a look at it." Tommy was sitting at her kitchen table, already dressed and eating a bowl of cereal. "Dad's really good at fixing things," he announced proudly. Margaret blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that. I've been meaning to call a plumber, but plumbers are expensive," David finished with an understanding nod. "This just needed a new washer. I found one in your toolbox that fits perfectly." The truth was, Margaret had been putting off calling a plumber because money was tight. Working at the diner paid enough to cover her basic bills, but there wasn't much left over for things like home repairs. She'd been putting a bowl under the dripping faucet every night for 3 months. "There," David said, turning the faucet on and off a few times. "No drip. Good as new." "I can't believe you fixed it," Margaret said, genuinely amazed. "Thank you so much. How did you know how to do that?" David shrugged, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I've always been handy with repairs. You pick things up over the years." After breakfast, they all walked outside to assess the damage from the storm. Millbrook looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Tree branches were scattered everywhere, and Margaret counted at least 4 trees that had fallen completely over. The power lines were down in several places, and she could see that the road leading out of town was blocked by a massive oak tree. "Looks like we're not going anywhere today," David observed, but he didn't seem upset about it. If anything, he seemed almost pleased. "The county road crew will probably have everything cleared up in a day or two," Margaret said. "They're pretty good about getting things back to normal after storms like this." As they walked around the neighborhood, Margaret noticed that David was paying close attention to everything. He asked questions about the empty houses they passed, about which businesses had closed recently, and about how many people still lived in town. "It seems like a lot of places are empty," he commented as they passed a row of houses with overgrown yards and boarded-up windows. "Yeah," Margaret sighed. "Millbrook used to have almost 3,000 people. Now we're down to maybe 800. Most of the young families have moved away looking for work. What happened to the jobs?" Margaret explained about the factories closing, how the furniture plant had been the biggest employer in town until it shut down 5 years ago. The textile mill had closed 2 years after that, and then the small manufacturing company that made car parts had moved their operations to Mexico. "It's been really hard," she admitted. "A lot of people lost their jobs and couldn't find new ones. The town's been struggling ever since." David listened carefully to everything she said, asking thoughtful questions about the town's history and its current challenges. Tommy chimed in occasionally, but mostly he seemed content to explore, picking up interesting rocks and watching a family of squirrels that had made their home in a fallen tree. When they got back to Margaret's house, David immediately started looking around for other things that needed fixing. "Your front gate is hanging off its hinges," he pointed out. "And I noticed some loose boards on your front steps." "You really don't have to," Margaret started to protest. "I want to," David interrupted gently. "You've been incredibly kind to us. This is the least I can do to say thank you." And so began what Margaret would later remember as one of the nicest weeks she'd had in years. Every morning, David would find something to repair around her house. He fixed the gate, tightened the loose boards on the front steps, and even managed to get her temperamental garage door working properly again. But it wasn't just the repairs that made the week special. It was the company. Tommy turned out to be a delightful kid. He was curious about everything, asking Margaret to tell him stories about growing up in Millbrook, about her grandmother's boarding house, and about what the town had been like in its heyday. He helped her in her small vegetable garden, carefully weeding around her tomato plants and watering her herbs. "My mom never wanted a garden," Tommy confided one afternoon as they picked green beans together. "She said it was too much work and too messy." "Well, gardens are work," Margaret agreed. "But it's good work." And there's something special about eating vegetables you grew yourself. Tommy nodded seriously, as if this was very important information he needed to remember. David, meanwhile, proved to be excellent company in a different way. He was a good listener, and he seemed genuinely interested in Margaret's stories about the town. In the evenings, after dinner, they would sit on her front porch and talk while Tommy played in the yard. Margaret found herself telling David things she hadn't talked about in years, how lonely it had been after her grandmother died, how worried she was about Millbrook's future, and how sometimes she wondered if she should have left town like so many others had. "But this is your home," David said one evening. "That means something." "Sometimes I wonder if that's enough," Margaret replied honestly. "When you watch a place you love slowly dying, you start to question whether staying is brave or just stubborn." David was quiet for a moment, watching Tommy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I think," he said finally, "that people like you are what keep communities alive. The ones who stay, who care, who keep believing that things can get better." There was something in his voice, a certainty, almost like he knew something she didn't. But when Margaret looked at him, he was just watching Tommy with a small smile on his face as the days passed and the roads were cleared. Margaret kept expecting David to announce that they were leaving. Their rental car had been towed to the local garage and repaired. There was nothing keeping them in Millbrook anymore, but David didn't mention leaving. Instead, he asked if they could extend their stay. "Tommy's really taken to this place," he explained one morning over breakfast. "And honestly, so have I. We're not in any hurry to get back home. Would it be too much trouble if we stayed a little longer?" Margaret's heart leaped. She'd grown so fond of both of them, and the thought of the house being quiet and empty again was depressing. "Of course you can stay," she said quickly. "Stay as long as you want." That afternoon, as Margaret was getting ready for her shift at the diner, she overheard David on the phone in the living room. He was speaking quietly, but she caught fragments of the conversation. "Yes, I'm still in the field. Assessment is ongoing. Need more time to understand the full scope. When David noticed her in the doorway, he quickly wrapped up the call. "Work stuff," he explained with an apologetic smile. "Even on vacation, they won't leave you alone." Margaret nodded, though something about the conversation bothered her. The words David had been using didn't sound like the kind of thing most people talked about with their bosses. But she pushed the thought away. Everyone had work stress, and David had mentioned being between jobs anyway. What she didn't know was that David's work was far more complicated than she could have imagined, and what he was assessing wasn't a business opportunity or a consulting project. He was assessing whether the town of Millbrook could be saved. That evening, Margaret came home from her shift to find David and Tommy in her kitchen, working together to prepare dinner. Tommy was carefully stirring something on the stove while David chopped vegetables. "We thought we'd surprise you," David said. Tommy wanted to try making spaghetti sauce from scratch. "I used the tomatoes from your garden," Tommy added proudly. "Dad showed me how to peel them and everything." As they sat down to eat the meal they prepared together, Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. This was what family dinner was supposed to feel like. Comfortable, warm, full of conversation and laughter. Tommy told her about the book he was reading, a story about a boy who discovers a secret passage in an old house. David talked about some of the historical sites they'd visited on their road trip and how much he enjoyed learning about small-town America. "There's something special about places like this," he said, gesturing around Margaret's modest dining room. "Communities where people still know their neighbors, where there's real history and character." "Not many people our age see it that way," Margaret replied. "Most people think small towns are boring and backward." "Those people don't know what they're missing," David said firmly, after dinner. As Margaret was washing dishes, she noticed David step outside to take another phone call. Through the kitchen window, she could see him pacing back and forth on the front porch, talking intently into his phone. When he came back inside, he seemed energized in a way she hadn't seen before. "Everything okay?" she asked. "More than okay." David replied, but he didn't elaborate. That night, as Margaret was getting ready for bed, she heard Tommy and David talking quietly in their room across the hall. Margaret had been expecting David and Tommy to leave for over a week now. Their rental car was fixed, the roads were clear, and there was really no reason for them to stay in Millbrook any longer. But every time she thought David was about to announce their departure, he found another reason to extend their visit. "Tommy's really settled in here," he'd say. Or, "I'm enjoying the peace and quiet." Or, "We're in no rush to get back to the real world." Not that Margaret was complaining. Having them around had been wonderful. The house felt alive again in a way it hadn't since her grandmother died. There was conversation at dinner, laughter in the evenings, and the comfortable sounds of other people living their lives alongside hers. Tommy had started helping out at the diner after school, clearing tables and charming the regular customers with his polite manners and bright smile. David had become something of a handyman around the neighborhood, helping elderly residents with small repairs and odd jobs. Word had gotten around that Margaret's houseguest was handy with tools and generous with his time. "That man of yours is a keeper," Dolores from the post office told Margaret one afternoon. "Fixed my mailbox and wouldn't take a penny for it." "He's not my man," Margaret protested, feeling her cheeks warm. "He's just a friend who's staying with me temporarily." But even as she said it, Margaret wondered if that was entirely true anymore. There had been moments lately, conversations that lasted deep into the evening, comfortable silences while they worked in the garden together. The way David's face lit up when he saw her come home from work, that felt like something more than friendship. On a crisp Thursday morning in late October, Margaret was getting ready for her morning shift when David announced that he had some errands to run in town. "Nothing exciting," he said, adjusting his tie. Margaret had noticed that he'd been dressing more formally lately, in button-down shirts and slacks instead of the casual clothes he'd arrived in. "Just some phone calls to make and paperwork to handle." "Take your time," Margaret replied. "Tommy and I will be fine. He's coming to the diner with me today. Dorothy said she'd teach him how to make pie crust." As David headed out, Margaret noticed him checking his phone repeatedly and glancing at his watch. There was an energy about him, an anticipation that seemed different from his usual calm demeanor. The morning at the diner started normally enough. Tommy charmed the breakfast crowd, carefully measuring flour under Dorothy's watchful eye and asking endless questions about baking techniques. But around 10 o'clock, things began to feel different. First, Mayor Johnson came in, looking more stressed than Margaret had ever seen him. He ordered coffee but barely touched it, spending most of his time on his phone speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Then Councilwoman Rodriguez arrived, followed by 2 other town council members. They huddled together in the corner booth, passing around official-looking papers and speaking in voices too low for Margaret to overhear. "Something's up?" Dorothy muttered as she refilled the coffee pot. "Haven't seen the council members this worked up since the furniture plant closed." Margaret was starting to get a bad feeling in her stomach. Throughout Millbrook's recent struggles, there had been rumors about the state government stepping in, about the possibility of the town losing its charter if things didn't improve financially. But those had always seemed like distant threats, not immediate realities. Around noon, just as the lunch rush was starting, Mayor Johnson stood up and addressed the entire diner. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying over the usual chatter, "I need everyone to listen for a minute. We're calling an emergency town meeting for tonight at 7 o'clock in the community center. Everyone needs to be there. We've received some news from the state capitol that affects all of us." The diner went completely quiet. Margaret felt Tommy slip his hand into hers, sensing the tension even if he didn't understand what was happening. "Is it bad news?" called out Frank, who ran the hardware store. Mayor Johnson's expression was grim. "We'll discuss everything tonight. Just please make sure you're there." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of worried conversations and wild speculation. Margaret tried to focus on work, but her mind kept wandering to all the rumors she'd heard over the past year about towns losing their charters, about state takeovers, about communities being forced to merge with larger municipalities. When David Returned to the house that evening, he seemed different somehow. More focused, more serious. He changed into a dark suit and was carrying a briefcase that Margaret didn't remember seeing before. "How was your day?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice light despite her anxiety about the town meeting. "Productive," David replied, but he didn't elaborate. "I heard there's a town meeting tonight. You heard about that?" Margaret was surprised. "Word travels fast in a small town, I guess." "I'd like to come with you," David said, "if that's okay." "I'm curious about local government, and since we've been staying here." "Of course," Margaret agreed. "Though I have to warn you, it might not be very interesting. Small-town politics can be pretty boring." David smiled, but there was something in his expression that Margaret couldn't quite read. "I doubt it will be boring." The Millbrook Community Center hadn't been so full in years. Margaret estimated that at least half the town's adult population was there, crowding into folding chairs and lining the walls. She found seats near the middle of the room. With David and Tommy settling in beside her, Margaret noticed that David was taking in everything: the layout of the room, the faces in the crowd, the tension that was practically crackling in the air. He seemed less like a curious visitor and more like someone who was studying the situation for professional reasons. Mayor Johnson called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock. His face was pale, and Margaret noticed that his hands were shaking slightly as he shuffled through his papers. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know many of you have heard rumors, so I'm going to get straight to the point. This afternoon I received official notification from the state capitol about the status of our town charter." The room was so quiet Margaret could hear the old building's heating system humming. "As many of you know, the previous administration left us in serious financial trouble. The corruption investigation revealed that former Mayor Blake and his associates misappropriated over $200,000 in municipal funds. They also failed to properly maintain our infrastructure, neglected to pay several state fees, and left us with debts we're struggling to cover." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She'd known things were bad, but hearing the numbers made it real in a way that was terrifying. "The state has been monitoring our situation for the past 6 months," Mayor Johnson continued. "They've concluded that Millbrook is no longer financially viable as an independent municipality." Angry voices erupted throughout the room. "What does that mean?" someone shouted. "Are they shutting us down?" Mayor Johnson held up his hand for quiet. "The state is giving us one final opportunity to prove that we can recover. They're sending a special administrator to assess our situation and determine whether Millbrook can be saved or whether our charter should be revoked." "And if they revoke the charter?" called out Mrs. Patterson, who had taught at the elementary school for 40 years. "Then Millbrook would cease to exist as an independent town. We would be absorbed into the county, our services would be managed from the county seat, and our local government would be dissolved." The room exploded in voices, angry, frightened, desperate voices, all talking at once. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. This was her home, her community, the place where 4 generations of her family had lived and worked and built their lives. She glanced over at David, expecting to see the same shock and distress that everyone else was feeling. Instead, she was surprised to see him sitting calmly, watching the proceedings with an expression of intense concentration. Mayor Johnson was trying to restore order. "The administrator will arrive next week," he announced over the noise. "They'll spend several weeks reviewing our finances, our infrastructure, our population trends, and our economic prospects. Then they'll make a recommendation to the state about whether we can be viable with assistance or whether dissolution is our only option." "Who is this administrator?" demanded Frank from the hardware store. "What do they know about small towns?" "I don't have those details yet," Mayor Johnson admitted. "All I know is that they're supposed to be an expert in municipal recovery and that they have the authority to make binding decisions about our future." As the meeting dissolved into smaller groups of worried residents discussing their options, Margaret sat in stunned silence. She thought about her grandmother's house, about the diner where she'd worked for 15 years, about the cemetery where 4 generations of her family were buried. "Are you okay?" David asked quietly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, scooted closer to her and took her hand. "It's going to be okay," Tommy said, with the confidence that only children can manage. "Things always work out somehow." Margaret squeezed his hand, wishing she could feel that optimistic. Around them, her neighbors were making plans, some talking about moving away before property values dropped even further. In the days following the emergency town meeting, Margaret found herself paying closer attention to David in ways she hadn't before. Maybe it was the stress of everything happening with the town, or maybe it was because she was spending so much time worrying about the future. But she started noticing things about her house guest that didn't quite add up. The first thing that struck her as odd was how David handled the news about Millbrook's crisis. While everyone else in town was either panicking or angry or devastated, David seemed almost calm, not uncaring. He definitely seemed concerned about the situation and asked thoughtful questions about how it might affect different people in the community. But he didn't have the same sense of shock and helplessness that everyone else was feeling. "It's like he expected it," Margaret confided to Dorothy during a quiet moment at the diner. When Mayor Johnson was talking about the state administrator coming to town, David just sat there nodding like he already knew all about it. "Maybe he's just not as attached to the place as the rest of us," Dorothy suggested. "He's only been here a couple of weeks." But that didn't feel right to Margaret. David had shown genuine affection for Millbrook and its people. He'd spent hours listening to her stories about the town's history, and he'd gone out of his way to help neighbors with repairs and odd jobs. This wasn't the behavior of someone who didn't care. The second thing that bothered Margaret was David's phone calls. They'd become more frequent since the town meeting, and they always seemed to happen when he thought she wasn't around. Margaret didn't consider herself a nosy person, but when you live in the same house with someone, you can't help but overhear things. The conversations she caught fragments of didn't sound like anything a regular person would be discussing with their employer. Words like infrastructure assessment and economic indicators and demographic analysis weren't part of most people's vocabulary. And there was something about the way David spoke during these calls, with authority and confidence, like he was the one making decisions rather than taking orders. One evening, Margaret came home from her shift at the diner to find David sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by papers. There were charts and graphs and documents with official-looking letterheads spread across the entire surface. David was studying them intently, making notes in the margins with an expensive-looking pen. When he heard her come in, David quickly gathered up all the papers and slipped them into a briefcase she'd never seen before. "Working late?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Just some research," David replied with his usual charming smile. "You know how it is? Even on vacation, work has a way of following you around." "What kind of work do you do, exactly?" Margaret asked. She realized that in all their conversations over the past 3 weeks, David had been vague about his professional life. He'd mentioned being between jobs and doing consulting work, but he'd never been specific. "Municipal consulting," David said after a slight pause. "I help towns and cities with various administrative challenges." That made Margaret pause. Municipal consulting sounded awfully similar to the kind of work the state administrator would be doing in Millbrook. "That must be interesting work," she said carefully. "It can be," David agreed. "You get to see a lot of different communities, learn about their unique challenges and strengths." There was something in his tone that made Margaret feel like he was choosing his words very carefully. But before she could ask any follow-up questions, Tommy came bounding into the kitchen, full of excitement about a book he'd been reading. And the moment passed. The third thing that started bothering Margaret was Tommy's behavior. The boy had always been mature for his age, but lately he'd been giving his father looks that seemed loaded with meaning. It was like they were sharing some kind of secret that they couldn't talk about around her. One afternoon, while David was out making more mysterious phone calls, Margaret was helping Tommy with some homework when he made a comment that stuck with her. "Dad's really good at his job," Tommy said out of nowhere, looking up from his math worksheets. I'm sure he is, Margaret replied. What does your dad do for work, Tommy? Tommy got a funny look on his face like he'd said something he wasn't supposed to. He helps towns, he said carefully, when they have problems. What kind of problems? Like when they don't have enough money or when people are sad because things aren't working right? Tommy went back to his homework, but Margaret could tell. He was being careful not to say too much. That evening, Margaret decided to do a little detective work. While David was giving Tommy a bath, she casually looked through the briefcase he'd left sitting by the front door. She felt guilty about snooping. But her curiosity was getting the better of her. What she found inside made her heart race. There were documents with the official seal of the state government, reports about municipal finances, and correspondence that mentioned Millbrook specifically. One letter was addressed to David Morrison, Special Administrator for Municipal Recovery. Margaret quickly closed the briefcase, her mind spinning. David Morrison. Not just David, but David Morrison, Special Administrator. She'd heard that title before at the town meeting, when Mayor Johnson had talked about the state sending someone to assess whether Millbrook could be saved, but that couldn't be right. The administrator wasn't supposed to arrive until next week. And David had been staying in her house for 3 weeks already, long before the crisis became public knowledge. Unless David hadn't come to Millbrook by accident at all. Margaret spent the rest of the evening trying to act normal, but her mind was racing with questions. Had David's car really broken down, or had that been a convenient excuse? Had he chosen her house specifically, or was it really just chance that he'd knocked on her door during the storm? And if David really was the state administrator, why was he hiding his identity? Why was he living in her house and eating at her table and fixing her faucet instead of staying at a hotel and conducting official business? The more she thought about it, the more pieces seemed to fit together. David's detailed questions about the town's problems, his calm reaction to the crisis announcement, his mysterious phone calls and official-looking paperwork, even his extensive knowledge about municipal finance and government operations. But if David was here to decide Millbrook's fate, what did that mean for their relationship? Had everything between them been a lie? Had he been studying her and her neighbors like specimens in a laboratory? Margaret felt sick to her stomach. The next morning she watched David more carefully than ever. He was getting dressed in another expensive suit, and she noticed that his shoes looked like they cost more than she made in a month. His watch, which she'd admired before, was clearly a luxury brand. Even his cologne smelled expensive. How had she not noticed these things before? David had been living like someone with a comfortable income, not someone who was between jobs and traveling on a budget with his 10-year-old son. I'll be out for most of the day again, David announced over breakfast. More errands to run? What kind of errands? Margaret asked, unable to keep a slight edge out of her voice. David glanced at her sharply, as if he'd picked up on her change in tone. Just business things. Paperwork, phone calls, that sort of thing. Must be important business if it can't wait until after your vacation. Sometimes timing is everything, David said carefully. After David left, Margaret found herself pacing around her house, trying to figure out what to do with her suspicions. Should she confront him directly? Should she call Mayor Johnson and share what she'd discovered? Should she just wait and see what happened? The problem was that she still wasn't 100% certain. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for everything. Maybe David really was just a consultant who happened to work in municipal government and happened to have some documents related to towns with similar problems to Millbrook's, but deep down, Margaret knew that wasn't the case. Too many things pointed to David being exactly who she suspected he was. That afternoon, while Tommy was at the library, Margaret decided to do something she'd never done before in her life. She called the state capitol and asked to speak to someone in the municipal affairs department. I'm calling about the special administrator who's being sent to Millbrook, she told the receptionist. One moment, please, the woman said. After a brief hold, she came back on the line. The administrator for the Millbrook assessment is David Morrison. He began his fieldwork last week. Margaret's heart sank. There it was, confirmation of what she'd already suspected. "Is Mr. Morrison available to speak?" Margaret asked, not sure what she'd say if they transferred her to David's office. "Mr. Morrison is currently in the field conducting his assessment. He won't be available for direct contact until he completes his preliminary report." Margaret hung up the phone, feeling like her world had been turned upside down. For 3 weeks, she'd been sharing her home, her meals, and increasingly her heart with a man who'd been lying to her about who he was and why he was in Millbrook. But the worst part wasn't even the deception. The worst part was that David Morrison, the real David Morrison, the state administrator with the power to save or destroy her town, had been watching Millbrook from the inside. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made Margaret feel hopeful about new beginnings. But today all she felt was a knot of anxiety in her stomach. According to Mayor Johnson's announcement at the emergency meeting, the state administrator was supposed to arrive today to begin the assessment that would determine Millbrook's fate. Margaret had spent the weekend in a strange state of limbo, knowing David's secret but not knowing what to do about it. She'd watched him go about his usual routine, helping Tommy with homework, fixing a squeaky hinge on her neighbor's gate, making those mysterious phone calls, all while her mind raced with questions about his real purpose in Millbrook. Several times she'd almost confronted him directly, but something held her back. Maybe it was fear of what his reaction would be, or maybe it was the hope that there was still some explanation that would make sense of everything. Or maybe, if she was being honest with herself, she was afraid of what it would mean for their relationship when the truth finally came out. David seemed unusually energetic that morning, checking his watch frequently and adjusting his tie multiple times. He was dressed in his most formal suit, navy blue with a crisp white shirt and a tie that probably cost more than Margaret's weekly grocery budget. "Big day?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual as she poured coffee. "Could be," David replied, but he didn't elaborate. "I might be tied up for most of the day." "Will you and Tommy be okay without me?" "We've managed this long, Margaret." Sighed, though the words came out sharper than she'd intended. David gave her a curious look. "Are you sure you're okay?" "You seem tense since the weekend." "I'm fine," Margaret lied. "Just worried about what today might bring for the town." "I understand," David said gently. "Change is always scary, even when it might be for the better." There was something in his tone, a confidence, almost like he knew what kind of change was coming, that made Margaret's suspicions flare up again. After David left the house, Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She made mistakes taking orders at the diner, spilled coffee on a customer's newspaper, and burned a batch of toast because she was too distracted to pay attention. "You're a mess today," Dorothy observed during a brief lull in the morning rush. "What's got you so worked up?" "The administrator is supposed to arrive today," Margaret explained, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "Right," Dorothy nodded grimly. "I wonder what kind of person they'll send. Probably some bureaucrat who's never lived in a small town and doesn't understand what places like Millbrook mean to people." Margaret felt a pang of guilt. David had definitely shown that he understood what Millbrook meant to its residents. The question was whether that understanding would work in the town's favor or against it. Around 10 o'clock, Mayor Johnson hurried into the diner looking even more stressed than usual. He ordered coffee but kept checking his phone every few seconds. "Any word on when the administrator will arrive?" asked Frank, who'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for an hour while speculating about what the assessment would involve. "That's the strange thing," Mayor Johnson replied, running his hand through his thinning hair. "I was supposed to receive a call this morning with details about their arrival time and where they'd be staying. But when I called the state office, they said there'd been some kind of miscommunication." Margaret's heart started beating faster. What kind of miscommunication? Apparently the administrator has been in contact with them, but there was confusion about the timeline. "They said he'd be reaching out to me directly sometime today to arrange a meeting." "He?" Dorothy asked. "So we know it's a man." "That's about all I know," Mayor Johnson admitted. "His name is David Morrison, and he specializes in municipal recovery." Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. Margaret felt like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Hearing David's real name spoken out loud in this context made everything suddenly, undeniably real. The man who'd been living in her house, eating at her table, and slowly winning her heart was the same person. Who would decide whether Millbrook lived or died? Margaret? Dorothy's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Margaret managed to say, though she definitely wasn't. Just tired. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in some kind of surreal nightmare. For the rest of the morning, every conversation in the diner revolved around speculation about this David Morrison and what he might be like. Customers debated whether he'd be fair or biased, whether he'd understand small-town values, whether he'd give Millbrook a real chance or had already made up his mind to recommend dissolution. Margaret listened to it all while feeling like she was going to be sick. These were her friends and neighbors, people she'd known all her life, and they were talking about David, her David, like he was some unknown threat coming to destroy their community. The worst part was that she couldn't even defend him without revealing what she knew. Around noon, Margaret's anxiety reached a breaking point. She asked Dorothy to cover for her and drove home, hoping to find some evidence that would either confirm or disprove her suspicions once and for all. The house was empty. David was presumably wherever he was conducting his mysterious business, and Tommy was at school. Margaret felt like a criminal as she went through David's belongings more thoroughly than she'd ever done before. In his briefcase, she found official correspondence between David Morrison and various state departments. There were detailed reports about Millbrook's financial situation, population trends, and economic prospects. There were assessment forms and evaluation criteria and the preliminary timeline for the review process. And there, at the bottom of the stack, was a document that made Margaret's blood run cold. It was an initial assessment memo dated just 3 days ago. With David's signature at the bottom, the memo outlined significant concerns about Millbrook's viability as an independent municipality. It noted the aging population, the lack of economic opportunities, the deteriorating infrastructure, and the substantial debt left by the previous administration's corruption. The language was clinical and professional, but the implications were clear. David was not optimistic about the town's chances for recovery. Margaret sank into a chair, feeling like her world was crumbling around her. Not only had David been lying to her about who he was, but his professional assessment suggested that he was already leaning toward recommending that Millbrook be dissolved. She was still sitting there, staring at the damning document, when she heard Tommy's voice calling from the front door. "Margaret, I'm home." Margaret quickly shoved the papers back into the briefcase and tried to compose herself. Tommy bounded into the kitchen, full of his usual 10-year-old energy. "How was school?" Margaret asked, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Good. We learned about local government today. Mrs. Patterson said the state is sending someone to decide if our town gets to stay a town. Is that true?" Margaret's heart ached. "Yes, it's true." "That's kind of scary," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "But Dad says everything will work out okay." "Your dad said that?" Tommy nodded. "He knows about stuff like this because of his job." Margaret looked at this sweet, innocent boy who had no idea that his father was the person everyone in town was worried about. "Tommy," she said carefully, "what exactly does your dad do for work?" Tommy got that same guarded expression he'd had before. "He helps towns when they have problems," he said slowly. "What kind of help does he give them?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to decide how much he could say. "He figures out if they can be fixed or if they need to change." The innocent way Tommy explained his father's job made it sound almost benign. But Margaret now understood the weight of what David did for a living. He was the person who decided which communities lived and which ones died. That evening, David returned home later than usual, and Margaret noticed immediately that something had changed about his demeanor. He seemed more focused, more serious, like he'd shifted into a different mode of being. "How was your day?" Margaret asked, watching his face carefully. "Productive," David replied. I had some important meetings. Actually, I have some news. Margaret's heart started pounding. What kind of news? The state administrator finally made contact with the town council. They're going to meet tomorrow morning to begin the formal assessment process. David delivered this information like he was just passing along something he'd heard around town. But Margaret could see something in his eyes, an excitement, maybe, or anticipation. Do you know anything about this administrator? Margaret asked, testing him. Not much, David said, which was perhaps the biggest lie he'd told yet. Just that he's supposed to be experienced with these kinds of situations. That night, as Margaret lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of David's late-night phone calls, she realized that tomorrow would change everything. The truth would finally come out, and she would have to face the reality of who David really was and what that meant for both her feelings and her town's future. She also realized that she had a choice to make. She could keep David's secret and let tomorrow's revelation play out naturally, or she could warn the town council about what she'd discovered. Tuesday morning dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of heavy clouds that promised rain before the day was over. Margaret woke up after a restless night of tossing and turning, her stomach churning with anxiety about what the day would bring. She could hear David moving around in the bathroom across the hall, and the familiar sounds of his morning routine, the shower running, the electric shaver humming, felt different now that she knew who he really was. Every ordinary moment had taken on new meaning since she'd discovered his true identity. When Margaret made her way downstairs, she found David in the kitchen making breakfast. He was dressed in his most formal suit, charcoal gray with a white shirt and a deep blue tie, and he looked every inch the government official he actually was. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes were polished to a shine, and there was an air of authority about him that she'd never noticed before, or maybe she had noticed it. But she'd just interpreted it differently when she thought he was simply a divorced father on a road trip with his son. Morning, David said, looking up from the stove where he was scrambling eggs. I made extra breakfast. I thought you might want to eat before the big day. The big day? Margaret repeated, accepting the plate he handed her. The town meeting with the administrator, David explained, not quite meeting her eyes. I imagine everyone's pretty nervous about it. Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign that he was about to come clean about who he really was. But David seemed determined to maintain his facade right up until the last possible moment. Tommy came bouncing down the stairs, already dressed for school and chattering about a science project he was working on. As Margaret watched the boy eat his breakfast and listened to his father's advice about the school day ahead, she felt a pang of sadness. In just a few hours, Tommy's simple world where his dad was just his dad would become much more complicated. Will you be at the meeting today? David asked Margaret as she was getting ready to leave for her morning shift at the diner. Of course, Margaret replied. Everyone will be there. This is the most important thing that's happened in Millbrook in years. I'm sure it will all work out for the best, David said, and there was something in his voice, a confidence that went beyond mere optimism, that made Margaret wonder if he'd already made his decision about the town's future. The diner was buzzing with nervous energy when Margaret arrived for work. It seemed like half the town had decided to gather there before the official meeting, drinking coffee and speculating about what the administrator would be like and what questions he might ask. I heard he's supposed to be really tough, said Mrs. Patterson, who was on her third cup of coffee despite usually limiting herself to one. My sister's town went through this same process 2 years ago, and their administrator recommended dissolution after just 1 week. Maybe this one will be different, suggested Frank, though he didn't sound very hopeful. Maybe he'll see what we see, that Millbrook is worth saving. Margaret listened to the conversation swirling around her while trying to focus on taking orders and serving customers. She felt like she was living in 2 different realities, the one where her neighbors worried about an unknown administrator who might destroy their town, and the one where that administrator was the man she'd been falling in love with for the past 3 weeks. Around 10 o'clock, Mayor Johnson arrived looking more nervous than Margaret had ever seen him. His hands were shaking as he ordered coffee, and he kept checking his watch every few minutes. Any word from the administrator? Dorothy asked. He called this morning to confirm the meeting, Mayor Johnson replied. Said he'd be there at 11. Sharp. He sounded... The mayor paused, searching for the right word. Professional. Very professional. Margaret almost smiled at that. If there was one thing she'd learned about David over the past few weeks, it was that he could definitely be professional when the situation called for it. Did he say anything about his assessment so far? Frank wanted to know. No, nothing like that. He just confirmed the time and said he looked forward to meeting with the council and the community. As 11 o'clock approached, the diner gradually emptied as people made their way to the community center. Margaret asked Dorothy to cover for her again, the second time in 2 days, which was unusual for her, and joined the stream of residents walking toward the meeting. The community center was even more packed than it had been for the emergency meeting the week before. Margaret estimated that nearly the entire adult population of Millbrook was there, along with many of the older teenagers. She found a seat in the middle section, close enough to see and hear everything, but not so close that she'd be obvious if her emotions got the better of her as she settled into her folding chair. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was sure the people around her could hear it. In just a few minutes, David would walk through those doors and reveal himself as the administrator everyone had been dreading. And she would have to sit there and pretend to be as shocked as everyone else. Mayor Johnson called the meeting to order at exactly 11 o'clock. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice shaky with nerves. As you know, we're here to meet with the state administrator who will be conducting the assessment of our town's viability. The room was completely silent except for the sound of people shifting in their seats and the old building's heating system humming in the background. I've been in contact with Mr. Morrison, and he should be arriving any moment to introduce himself and explain the assessment process. Margaret scanned the room and noticed that David was nowhere to be seen. She'd expected him to be sitting in the back, maintaining his cover until the moment of revelation. But apparently he was planning to make a more dramatic entrance. Mayor. Johnson glanced at his watch. He should be here any minute, he said, more to himself than to the crowd. As if on cue, the main doors to the community center opened. Margaret turned along with everyone else, expecting to see David walk in, but the doors just stayed open, and nobody came through them. Mr. Morrison? Mayor Johnson called out uncertainly. I'm here, came a familiar voice from the front of the room. Margaret whipped her head around and felt her world tilt sideways. David was standing at the front of the room, next to the makeshift podium that Mayor Johnson had been using. He must have come in through the side entrance while everyone was looking toward the main doors, but that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that Margaret was apparently the only person in the room who recognized him. David was wearing the same suit he'd put on that morning, but somehow he looked completely different. His posture was straighter, his expression was more serious, and there was an unmistakable air of authority about him that transformed him from Margaret's helpful houseguest into someone who clearly wielded significant power. Ladies and gentlemen, David said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent room, I'm David Morrison, and I've been appointed by the governor as your special administrator for municipal recovery. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Margaret could hear people around her whispering variations of, who is he, and where did he come from? And I've never seen him before. But Margaret sat frozen in her chair, watching as the man she thought she knew revealed himself to be someone completely different. I know many of you are wondering why you haven't seen me before today, David continued, seeming completely comfortable with the attention of the entire room. The truth is, I've been in Millbrook for the past 3 weeks, conducting what we call a preliminary assessment. More confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret noticed several people looking around as if trying to figure out how a stranger could have been in their small town for 3 weeks without anyone noticing. During that time, David went on, I've had the opportunity to observe your community from the inside, to understand your challenges and your strengths from the perspective of a resident rather than an outside official. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. Every conversation she'd had with David, every story she told him about the town's history and struggles, every moment of vulnerability she'd shared, all of it had been part of his professional assessment. "I've seen how neighbors help each other during difficult times," David said, and Margaret was sure she saw his eyes flick in her direction. "I've observed the strong sense of community that exists here, the pride people take in their hometown, and the determination to preserve what makes Millbrook special." Mayor Johnson looked completely bewildered. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not sure I understand. If you've been in town for 3 weeks, where have you been staying? How is it that no one has seen you?" David's expression softened slightly, and again Margaret felt like he was looking directly at her. "I've been staying with a local resident who was kind enough to offer shelter to a stranger during the storm 3 weeks ago. Someone who embodies the very best of what small-town hospitality and generosity can be." Margaret felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her as people began to put the pieces together. Mrs. Patterson, who was sitting 2 rows behind her, gasped audibly. "Margaret Chun took in my son and me when our car broke down during that bad storm," David continued. "She had no idea who I was or why I was really in Millbrook." Margaret didn't remember walking home from the community center. One moment she was leaning against the brick wall trying to catch her breath, and the next she was sitting on her front porch steps, staring at the gate that David had fixed just 2 weeks ago. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, the white picket fence that needed paint, the garden where she and Tommy had picked vegetables together, the front steps where David had tightened the loose boards. But somehow it all felt different now. Like she was looking at her own life through someone else's eyes. She sat there for what felt like hours, watching neighbors walk by on their way home from the meeting. Some of them looked at her with curiosity, others with what might have been sympathy, and a few with expressions she couldn't quite read. Nobody stopped to talk, which was unusual in a town where people normally couldn't walk down the street without getting pulled into at least 3 conversations. Margaret supposed she couldn't blame them for not knowing what to say. What do you say to someone who's been unknowingly harboring the person who might destroy your town? Around 2 o'clock she heard footsteps on the sidewalk and looked up to see David approaching the house. He'd changed out of his formal suit and was back to wearing the casual clothes that had become familiar to her over the past 3 weeks. But even dressed casually, he looked different now. There was something about his posture, his expression, that marked him as someone with authority and responsibility. "Margaret," he said softly as he reached the front gate. "Can we talk?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to tell him to go away, to find somewhere else to stay now that his cover was blown. But a bigger part of her, the part that had grown genuinely fond of this man over the past 3 weeks, wanted answers. "I suppose we need to," she said finally. David opened the gate and walked up the path, but instead of going toward the front door, he sat down on the porch steps beside her, close enough to talk comfortably, but not so close that she'd feel pressured or overwhelmed. "I know you must have a lot of questions," he began. "A few," Margaret said dryly. David smiled slightly at her tone. "Where would you like me to start?" Margaret thought about all the questions that had been swirling through her mind since the revelation at the meeting. "I guess I'd like to know how much of it was real." "What do you mean? The car breaking down, the storm, ending up at my house. Was any of that actually true, or was it all just part of some elaborate plan?" David was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street where a few neighbors were working in their yards, studiously avoiding looking in their direction. "The car breaking down was real," he said finally. "The storm was definitely real. And ending up at your house was completely by chance. But you were already in Millbrook to do the assessment." "Yes," David admitted. "I'd arrived that afternoon to begin what we call advanced reconnaissance. It's standard procedure. We like to get a sense of a community before the formal assessment begins. So you were planning to spy on us from the beginning." David winced at the word spy. "I was planning to observe, yes, but not the way it ended up happening." Margaret turned to look at him directly. "What was supposed to happen?" "I was supposed to check into a hotel in the county seat, about 30 miles from here. I was going to drive into Millbrook during business hours, maybe stop at a few public places, get a general sense of the economic situation and community dynamics. Then I would have introduced myself officially and conducted a standard assessment over the course of a week or two. But the car broke down, David confirmed. 2 miles outside of town, in the middle of the worst storm we'd seen in years. Tommy and I walked for over an hour before we saw your porch light. Margaret remembered that night, the howling wind, the torrential rain, the 2 bedraggled figures appearing at her door. It was hard to believe that what had felt like such a random encounter had actually been the beginning of something so complicated. When you opened your door and invited us in, David continued, I had a choice to make. I could tell you who I really was and why I was in Millbrook, or I could keep my identity quiet and see what happened. And you chose to lie. I chose to wait, David corrected gently. At first, I thought it would just be for one night. The storm would pass, we'd get our car fixed, and we'd be on our way. But then then what? David was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Then I realized I was getting an opportunity that I'd never had before in 15 years of doing this job. The chance to understand a community from the inside, as a neighbor rather than as a government official. Margaret felt a flare of anger. So we were just research subjects to you? No, David said firmly, turning to face her. That's not what it was. At least it's not what it became. Then what was it? David ran his hand through his hair, looking suddenly tired. Margaret, in my job, I see a lot of towns in crisis. Places where the economy has collapsed, where people are struggling, where local government has failed. And most of the time, I come in as this outside authority figure that everyone either fears or resents or tries to manipulate. Margaret could understand that. She'd seen how people in Millbrook had reacted just to the idea of the administrator coming to town. But living here, being part of daily life, seeing how people actually treat each other when they don't know they're being evaluated, it gave me insights I could never get from official interviews and financial reports. Insights like what? Like watching you take in 2 strangers during a storm without asking for anything in return. Like seeing Tommy help elderly neighbors with their groceries just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Like observing how the whole community rallied around the Williams family when their house had that kitchen fire last week. Margaret remembered that incident. The Williamses' stove had caught fire and damaged half their kitchen. Within hours, neighbors had organized meal deliveries. Someone had set up a fund to help with repairs, and 3 different people had offered temporary cooking facilities. Those are the kinds of things that don't show up in official assessments, David continued. But they're also the kinds of things that make communities resilient, that give them the foundation to recover from economic hardship. Margaret found herself softening slightly. She could understand the professional value of what David had observed. But that didn't change the fact that he'd been dishonest with her. Why didn't you tell me the truth? She asked. After the first few days, when you decided to stay longer, why didn't you trust me enough to explain who you really were? David was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. Because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid of what? Afraid that if you knew who I was, everything would change. The way you talked to me, the way you showed me around town, the way you... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. The way you made me feel welcome, Margaret felt her heart squeeze painfully. David, I know how people see me in my official capacity, he continued. I'm the guy who comes to town to decide whether your community lives or dies. I'm the enemy, the threat, the person everyone has to convince or impress or fear. And you didn't want me to see you that way. I didn't want you to see me that way, David confirmed. Because somewhere along the line, what you thought of me started to matter more than it should have for someone just doing his job. They sat in silence for a few moments, both looking out at the street where normal life was continuing around them. A dog barked in the distance, and Margaret could hear children playing in someone's backyard. There's something else, David said eventually. What? Tommy. This whole situation has been hard on him too. The divorce was difficult, and this job requires us to travel constantly. We never stay in one place long enough for him to make real friends or feel settled. Margaret thought about Tommy, his excitement about the garden, his eagerness to help at the diner, the way he'd lit up when Mrs. Patterson had let him help with a school project. But here, David continued, he was just a regular kid staying with a nice lady who treated him like family. He didn't have to be the administrator's son, or worry about people being nice to him because they wanted something from his father. He didn't know I didn't know, Margaret realized. He knew, David said. I told him the truth from the beginning because I didn't want him to have to lie. But I also told him that it was important to keep it between us until I decided how to handle the situation. Margaret remembered all those meaningful looks between David and Tommy, the way the boy had been careful about what he said regarding his father's work. She thought he was just being mature for his age, but actually he'd been keeping a very adult secret. That must have been hard for him. It was, especially as he got more attached to you and to Millbrook. He started asking me if we could stay longer, maybe even permanently. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. What did you tell him? I told him that my job requires us to travel and that we couldn't stay in one place forever. But honestly, Margaret, the idea of leaving has gotten harder every day. Because of the job? Because of you, David said quietly. 6 months later, Margaret woke up to the sound of construction equipment rumbling down Maple Street. But instead of feeling annoyed by the early morning noise, she smiled and stretched contentedly in her bed. The construction crews were working on the new sidewalks and streetlights that were part of Millbrook's downtown revitalization project, one of many improvements that had been made possible by David's recommendation to save the town. She could hear voices in the kitchen downstairs, David's deep laugh and Tommy's excited chatter about something that had happened at school. These had become the sounds of her morning routine, as familiar and comforting as her grandmother's old house settling around her. Margaret got dressed and made her way downstairs, where she found David at the stove making pancakes while Tommy sat at the kitchen table working on homework. "Good morning," David said, turning to give her a quick kiss on the cheek. Even after all these months, Margaret still felt a little thrill at these casual displays of affection. The man who had once been a mysterious stranger was now an integral part of her daily life. "Morning," she replied, ruffling Tommy's hair as she passed his chair. "What are you working on so early?" "Math homework," Tommy groaned. "But also planning for the school spring festival. I'm in charge of the game booth and I want it to be really good." The spring festival was new this year, one of many community events that had been organized as part of Millbrook's recovery plan. David had been instrumental in helping the town apply for grants and develop strategies to bring residents together and attract visitors from neighboring communities. "Any good ideas so far?" Margaret asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot David had already made. "I was thinking about a ring toss, but with prizes that are actually cool. Maybe gift certificates to the new bookstore or tickets to the movie theater when it reopens." Margaret exchanged a smile with David over Tommy's head. The boy had embraced his role as one of Millbrook's youngest boosters, always coming up with ideas to make the town more attractive to families with children. "Speaking of the movie theater," David said, flipping a pancake expertly, "I heard from the contractor yesterday. They think it'll be ready to reopen by Memorial Day weekend." "Really?" Margaret felt a surge of excitement. The old Millbrook Cinema had been closed for 3 years, but it was one of several businesses that were being renovated as part of the economic development plan. "That's wonderful news." The past 6 months had been full of wonderful news. After David submitted his recommendation to save Millbrook, things had moved quickly. The state had approved a comprehensive recovery plan that included infrastructure improvements, tax incentives for new businesses, and programs to encourage young families to move to the area. More importantly, the community had rallied around the effort to rebuild their town. Residents who had been considering moving away decided to stay and invest in Millbrook's future. Young people who had left for college or jobs in bigger cities started coming back. drawn by affordable housing and new economic opportunities. "I have news too," Margaret announced as they sat down to eat breakfast together. "Dorothy wants to retire next year, and she's asked if I'd be interested in buying the diner." David looked up from his pancakes, clearly excited. "Margaret, that's fantastic. Are you going to do it?" "I think so," Margaret said, still hardly believing it herself. "I've been saving money, and with the loan programs the state set up for small businesses, I think I can make it work." "You'd be a great restaurant owner," Tommy said confidently. "Everyone loves eating at the diner when you're working." "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret said, feeling a warm glow at the boy's support. Over the past months, Tommy had become like the son she'd never had, and his opinion mattered to her as much as David's did. "We should celebrate," David suggested. "How about dinner at that new Italian place in the next town over?" "Sounds perfect," Margaret agreed, as they finished breakfast and got ready for their respective days. Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since that stormy night when two strangers had appeared on her doorstep. She was no longer just Margaret Chun, who worked at the diner and lived alone in her grandmother's house. She was Margaret Chun, who was planning to own her own business, who was part of the family again, and who had played a small but important role in saving her community. David's work in Millbrook had officially ended 2 months ago, when the state had approved all the recovery programs and released the funding for infrastructure improvements. But instead of moving on to his next assignment, he had requested an extended leave of absence to help with implementation. "Just until everything is well established," he told his supervisors. But Margaret suspected that his reasons for staying had more to do with personal happiness than professional responsibility. They had talked about the future many times over the past few months. David's job usually required extensive travel, but he'd been offered a position with the state that would allow him to work from a regional office, conducting assessments and providing ongoing support to communities within a few hours' drive of Millbrook. It would mean less travel, he'd explained to Margaret one evening as they sat on the front porch watching Tommy play with the neighbor kids. "I could actually have a home base, a real life outside of work." "And you want that home base to be here?" Margaret had asked. "I want it to be wherever you are," David had replied, taking her hand in his now. As Margaret got ready for her shift at the diner, she smiled at the memory of that conversation. They still hadn't made any official decisions about their future together, but every day felt like they were building something permanent and meaningful. The diner was busier than it had been in years when Margaret arrived for work. The construction crews working on various projects around town meant more customers, and several new families had moved to Millbrook in recent months. Dorothy was training 2 new part-time employees to handle the increased business. "Morning, Margaret," called out Frank, who was sitting at his usual table reading the newspaper. "Did you see the article about Millbrook in the regional paper?" "What article?" Margaret asked, grabbing the paper to take a look. The headline read, "Small Town Big Comeback, How Millbrook Became a Model for Rural Recovery." The article described the town's transformation over the past 6 months, highlighting the infrastructure improvements, new businesses, and growing population. It mentioned David's assessment and recommendation, though it focused more on the community's response than on any individual efforts. "We're famous," Dorothy laughed as she read over Margaret's shoulder. "Who would have thought?" "It's good publicity," Margaret observed. "Maybe it'll bring in some tourism." Tourism was one of the economic development strategies that David had helped the town pursue. Millbrook's location near several state parks and its charming downtown made it potentially attractive to visitors, especially as more businesses reopened and the town's appearance improved. Throughout the morning, Margaret served customers and listened to conversations about the various projects happening around town. The energy was completely different from 6 months ago, when people had been worried about whether Millbrook would even continue to exist. Now they were making plans, investing in improvements, and talking excitedly about the future. Around lunchtime, David stopped by the diner with Tommy, who was on a half-day schedule due to teacher conferences. "How's the famous restaurant owner?" David teased, giving Margaret a quick hug. "Don't get ahead of yourself," Margaret laughed. I haven't even signed the papers yet. But you're going to, right? Tommy asked anxiously. You're not going to change your mind? I'm not going to change my mind, Margaret assured him. This is my home, and I want to be part of making it even better. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself thinking about that word, home. For most of her life, home had been a place defined by the past, her family's history, her grandmother's house, her memories of what Millbrook used to be, but now home felt like something that was growing and changing, something that was being built rather than just preserved. David and Tommy were part of that new definition of home, but so were all the other people who had chosen to stay in Millbrook and work for its recovery. When Margaret's shift ended, she walked home through downtown, noting all the signs of progress. The empty storefronts that had "For Rent" signs 6 months ago were now occupied by a bookstore, a gift shop, and a small cafe. The sidewalks were new, the streetlights worked, and there were flower boxes under the windows of several businesses dotted home. She found David in the backyard working in the garden that had expanded significantly since Tommy had convinced him that they needed more vegetables. The boy himself was at the kitchen table doing homework while keeping an eye on a pot of soup that was simmering on the stove. "Smells good," Margaret said, giving Tommy a hug from behind. "Dad's teaching me how to make vegetable soup with stuff from our garden," Tommy explained proudly. "He said it's important to know how to cook real food, not just microwave stuff." "Your dad is very smart," Margaret agreed, smiling at David through the kitchen window that evening. As they sat down to eat the soup Tommy had helped prepare, Margaret looked around the table at the two people who had become her family and felt overwhelmed with gratitude.